Okay. Oh.
So, welcome everyone to the second seminar of Kateryna. From here, you can hear me also for the question later on.
Yeah, I mean it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. So welcome to the second seminar of Sport International Politics in Europe. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Kateryna Chernii. She worked at the University of Potsdam. I won't name the full institute, maybe Kateryna will do later because my German is worse than my Czech or my Slovak. It's better that I don't even try. Anyway, today Kateryna will introduce us a very important topic. We spoke in the last weeks about the impact on international sports, and especially in the impact in international sport of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And Kateryna, she's working on a project on the football players professional football players in Ukraine at the end of the Soviet Union, and today she will introduce. She will do a lesson on the topic sport and Ukrainian identity from 1991 to 2022. So I leave immediately the floor to her. She will speak for the time she is, but 40 minutes, maybe more, 1 hour, doesn't matter. But what is important then is, like we did the other time with Battaglia, is to have a moment for questions. You feel free to ask everything you want. So, Kateryna, thank you very much again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Should I start the presentation like fully, right? So you see it?
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. So yes, thank you for introducing me here. Like I do some small remarks. I mean, I work in a Center of Contemporary History in Potsdam, so it's like a separate institution from the University of Potsdam. So it's not that important, but it's rather like a separate institution. And yes, and today I'm really glad to talk about the topic which really moves me a lot. It's about sport and Ukrainian identity during the last 30 years of independent Ukraine. And I'm really glad to have a chance to talk about it today with you, and you can really ask the questions so we can discuss. So there are some topics which might be interesting for us to talk about. So I maybe shortly introduce myself to understand who I am and why do I do history and why do I am so interested in sport. So as was already said, I do my PhD on the topic of Ukrainian transformation, on example of Ukrainian football and its leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I rather show the process of transformation of structures of football clubs, but also on the personal level, how it happened from the Soviet Union to independent Ukraine. And I think that Ukrainian football is an enlightening case study of Ukrainian transformation to show the whole process, how it was and how it became, and what role does the Soviet legacy play for Ukrainian sport, but also for Ukrainian, for Ukraine as a whole. With the independence of Ukraine. So it's something that I'm working on in my PhD project. So it feels like I've been dealing with sport my whole life. And initially I wanted to become a sport journalist, but then I decided to history. And actually, I think it's something that I really enjoy now because it gives a chance to talk about sport from a very, very broader perspective. So I'm really interested to talk about sport beyond the sport competitions, beyond the sport results. And I think in our talk, we will also see that it is possible and it is play, an important and bigger role for the general developments, political, economical, and social developments generally. I work as a volunteer during the European Championships in Ukraine and Poland, and also during the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, 2014. So, and also before that, my PhD, I did my internship at the German Football Federation. So I got some insights of not only like what is it sport, but also how does the work function? So how these big events function, but also how these different sport institutions also function. So coming back to our topic, as I've told, I think sport always is something complex, something bigger than sport events itself. And it is something that worth to analyze, to dig deeper, and to explore. And especially for me, Ukrainian sport was always in focus of my interest and my attachment. And it is important to say that the developments of Ukrainian sports, primarily of competitive, of professional sport, experienced many different challenges in the last 30 years.
Kateryna, sorry if I interrupt. You
Yeah.
are sharing the screen, eh?
Yes.
Okay, no, we are not seeing it at the moment.
You're not seeing it, okay. I can,
Maybe-
but you can see also only me, right?
We can see you, yeah.
But I don't know why don't you see it? I can try another, like now. Do you see it?
Yeah, now, yes, perfect.
So now
Great.
you see it. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Should I come back? Like with
No.
But you don't need mask, so it's fine. So yes, and as I also seen in this photo, so Ukrainian sport experienced many different challenges and difficulties during the last 30 years. It was periods of hope, periods of happy moment, but also periods of sad and tragical events, which is also seen on this photo. Only 10 years difference, but we see what happened in Ukraine, Euro 2012, happiness, Ukraine against Sweden. I was at this football match. It was a really amazing game for Ukraine. And then 10 years after, we see, the first evidences of this very destructive war in Ukraine with this destroy Aqua Arena sport complex in Kharkiv, in the second biggest Ukrainian city. So why I'm talking about sport in a context of Ukrainian identity? Because sport was and it is an important part for the promotion of Ukrainian identity, and also an important instrument for unity, as something that was able to unite all Ukrainians after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So now, as I've told, Ukraine experienced a brutal Russian full-scale aggression starting from 24th of February 2022. It is, however, important to keep in mind that the war has been going already from 2014, from the illegal annexation of Crimea, from the war in eastern Ukraine. So it's something that has been going on for more than 8 years already. So coming back to sport. If we're talking about the Olympic idea of the father of the Olympic movement, Pierre de Coubertin, it was built on the idea of the political neutrality of Olympic movement and sport in general. However, as the developments of the last 100 years have showed, sport, unfortunately, or it is true reality, is not neutral and is not apolitical, even when it is aimed to be presented in such a way. The history of boycott movement, politicization of big sport events like Olympic Games, Football World Championships, prove it in a very considerable way. Since sport serves as one of the important instruments for the creation of common identity, it unites, but it also separates. In case of Ukraine, as a country with a long history of struggle for its statehood, sport was one of the instruments to convey local Ukrainian identity also during the Soviet times. and was one of the central instruments to build common identity, unite Ukrainians in all its diversity with the Declaration of Independence in 1991. So before talking about the developments in Ukraine from 1991, I will focus a bit and give you small insight into Ukrainian sport during the Soviet times, Ukrainian sport in the process of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then we will talk about the sport and its meaning for the independent Ukraine. And finally, we'll focus on the influence of the war in Ukraine in general.
We lost you, Kateryna. Dio. So cosa fare? She said that the internet disconnect. Let's hope that to restart soon. You have all signed the yeah. Oh, probably is the Russian propaganda that. Thank you. While we're waiting, are there what can we talk about? No, maybe no, because she didn't introduce. She was just introducing the topic, so we don't even have any comments in general. But on the speaking about the lesson that we did on the topic of the Russian invasion on Ukraine and sport, there are some elements that, according to you, we didn't have touched. So you have questions that maybe you were thinking to ask to Kateryna, some general thoughts. Ecco qua, no? Vabbè. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. It's my internet.
No problem. So you can share again the screen. Let's hope that the internet works. And
Yeah.
we lost you where you were introducing the topic of Ukrainian sport during Soviet Union. So yeah, probably the slide before. Yeah, from that. Yeah, perfect.
So I'm sorry, I'm coming back to Ukrainian sportsmen during the Soviet times. So hopefully it will work further. Yeah, so Ukrainian sport before 1991 was developing as part of the general sport developments in the Soviet Union. So do you see everything and hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. So started from the 50s, Soviet Union started increasingly use sports as one of the instruments of its political facade and influence abroad. And as a second biggest Soviet republic, Ukraine was among the leading sports republic in the Soviet Union in terms of sport. Many of the biggest Soviet sports stars were from Ukraine, and I just chose one of the prominent track and field athletes, like Soviet track and field athletes from Ukraine. And maybe you might know some of them, like Serhiy Bubka, is a pole vault jumper, 1988 Olympic Games champion, and the first person who cleared 6 meter high, and was like more than 20 years long the holder of the pole vault record until recently. So he was one of the biggest stars of the Soviet sport, and he was a Ukrainian guy from the Donbas region. So the second one is Yuri Sidikh. It's champion in a hammer throw. He used to hold also long record in a hammer throw. He was twice gold, 1 silver Olympian, and he was also one of the biggest Soviet stars at that time. And the last one is Usain Bolt of the Soviet team. So 100 and 200 meters Olympic champion in the Olympic Games Munich 1972, Valery Borzov. So these guys were the stars of the Soviet sport, but at the same time, they were also the stars of Ukrainian sport. And we also see the biographies and the developments of them after their professional sport career. For example, Valery Borzov became the first president of Ukrainian Olympic Committee, and the Serhiy Bubka is a current president of Ukrainian Olympic Committee. So this long legacy from Soviet sport to Ukrainian sport, it is important part, of course, of Ukrainian sport developments now. A very special role played football and successes of Ukrainian football players, successes from Dynamo Kiev and its coach Valery Lobanovsky for the Soviet football, but at the same time it was a very important symbolic, it was very, so to say, symbolic team, Dynamo Kiev generally, and also Ukrainian football players played a very important role for the local identities of Ukrainians, and primarily from the people from the capital city, from Kiev. So it was periods in 70s and in 80s when the Soviet national football team used to be called Dynamo team, because in some particular periods, the majority of the Soviet football players on the national football teams were from Dynamo Kiev, and Valery Lobanovsky was simultaneously the trainer of the Dynamo Kiev team and also the trainer of the Soviet national football team. So Dynamo Kiev won twice this UEFA Cup Winners' Cup in 1975 and 1986, which made it possible for the France press to call Dynamo Kiev as to be recognized the best Eastern European football club of the 20th century. So you see here the two biggest stars of that period, Oleg Blokhin and Ihor Bilanov, who won in 70s and 80s the title of the best football player of Europe at that time. And it was, of course, the big success for the Soviet football, which was officially seen as amateur in a concurrence with the professional Western European football. So it was also a concurrence between two systems, but at the same time, it was also a concurrence on an inter-Soviet level. We see it in the research of Manfred Zeller. So actually, if we're coming back to this question of identities, we can see that Ukrainian sportsmen were on one hand, of course, part of this Soviet team as part of the Soviet identity abroad. At the same time, Ukrainian sportsmen represented the local identity of Ukraine, at that time of Ukraine, Soviet Republic. And even then, however, it is important to say that the understanding of this Ukrainian identity might have varied by different Ukrainian sportsmen at that time. It's a very interesting research coming back to the book of Manfred Zeller, Sport and Society in the Soviet Union, The Politics of Football After Stalin, where he analyzes actually the rivalry between the biggest Soviet football clubs and the fan culture in the Soviet Union. And in his book, he points out that the rivalry between the biggest Soviet football clubs was not only a sport concurrence, but also the expression of antagonism between different nations of the Soviet Union. So, for example, one of the central rivals in the Soviet football starting from the 60s and until the very end of the Soviet Union was a concurrence between the biggest football clubs from Moscow against Dynamo Kiev. Between the center and periphery, where Dynamo Kiev was still considered the most successful football club, and we see it also as the cover of one of the most important Soviet magazine at that time. So Dynamo Kiev with a scarf. It's like very symbolic photo at that time. So it also represents this concurrence. It also represents for Ukrainians, but also from people living in Kiev, from people living in Ukraine at that time, this local identities. And Dynamo Kiev was a football club not only supported by Kievans, but also it was considered as the Ukrainian football club #1 at the time. And it's still, until now, considered to be football club #1, even though from the sportive perspective, it's not the most successful football club in Ukraine for now. So if we're talking about the research of Manfred Zeller, he shows how the people in the Soviet Union looked for the ways out of the totalitarian system, tried to create their own forms of communities through sports, because the support of a particular team was a manifestation of particular belongings, of particular community. And at the same time, these different formed communities led, of course, to this confrontation between different national groups in the Soviet Union. Manfred Zeller shows how the question of the national identity was an issue in the Soviet sport and became only stronger during the reforms of perestroika of Mikhail Gorbachev in the end of the Soviet Union and during the collapse of the former biggest state in the world. So if you are talking about Ukrainian sport and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are two central issues. The first one is an issue of transition, so the question of transitional period, so from Soviet to Ukrainian sport. And the next one is a question of legacy. So who will get the Soviet legacy of sport after the dissolution of the Soviet Union? If you're talking about the transitional period, and we see it on this photo, so on one hand, we see this amazing team of Commonwealth of Independent States national football team, CIC team, which took part in the European Championship 1992. And that same year, we also see the CIC team during the Summer Olympic Games in Barcelona, and also during the Winter Olympic Games in 1992 in Albertville in France. So it was three big sport events where there was no Soviet team, but there was no Ukrainian team as well. So if we're coming back more deeply into the issue of football, so when Soviet team got the chance to play on the Euro 1992, there was no Soviet Union anymore in the way. So it was a question who will take part in that events. Should the team be banned, or who has to participate in this kind of events? So it was taken as a compromise. So the CIC team, which actually was only renamed Soviet national team, will take part in these events. And like the team was the consideration of the team was primarily Ukrainian, Russian, like one Georgian football player. So it was kind of Russian-Ukrainian team with some few representatives of the other republics. It was very unsuccessful Euro for this team. So in the end, the capital of the CIC national team, Ukrainian football player Mikhailichenko, said that in retrospect, characterizing that event, he said, okay, it was a team without a flag, without an anthem. And when you step on a field, it's better to know who you represent. So it was also a question of if we do sport, and if we do the sport on this international high level, so it is still important that question of belongings, question who we represent, question who we then support. And coming back to Mikhailichenko, he was a very successful football player, but regarding that event, like Euro 1992, he also said it was probably the saddest moment in my playing career. It was not a team, it was a selection of players who had put on the same jerseys a strange acronym of CIC instead of the coat of arms. The collapse of the Soviet Union already took place at that time, but the CIC team, but also the CIC Olympic team, was kind of the last embodiment of the old Soviet regime. And at the end, it could not be alternative for the independent teams of independent post-Soviet republics in football, but also in other sports. Talking about Olympic Games, it also was interesting because at that time, we're talking about Winter Olympic Games, which took place earlier than Barcelona 1992. So it was very fresh, like it was first months after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So actually everything was focused on the CIC symbolic. So everything, so you also see actually on this photo in Barcelona, it changed a bit. So the sportsmen were holding their national flags, and at the same time, they were a united team of these former Soviet republics. And also in Barcelona, it was allowed to their winners, so to say, to hear their own anthem, to see their own flag, even though they were part of the CIC team. At the time, Valery Borzov, who was the first president of the National Olympic Committee, the guy who was a former runner, he said that at the time it was very hard for Ukraine to actually be independent team, even though Ukraine had many successful sportsmen at the time, because in comparison to the Baltic countries who participated on Olympics 1992 as independent states, Ukrainian team did not have a predecessor of this Olympic movement before as Baltic countries, who took place already in Olympic Games in 20s and 30s. So for Ukraine, it was a really hard decision and also a hard way to get its place in this national, among these national Olympic federations and movements. So it was a way. So it was not that they will say, okay, we'll do it, and in a very short perspective, they will get this place. Only 1993, Ukrainian National Olympic Committee was recognized. So only, so to say, from 1993, Ukraine is taking part as a normal National Olympic Committee with this team, with all this procedure. So it shows and gives us, coming back to the next question, to the question of legacy. So if we're talking about the question of legacy in sport, it is very much based on the UNO system when Russia was recognized as a sole successor of the Soviet Union. it also means that the same regulation was met in terms of sport. For football, it was a big shock because Russia was declared as a sole successor of the Soviet football past. And it means that, for example, for the World Cup 1994, the place in a qualification for that event got the newly created Russian national football team and not the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and any other team. And then was a question, so why did Russian national football team got this place if the most successful football players and teams were from Ukraine at the time in the Soviet Union? So it's also the question of structures. It's also a question of personal connections, because the president of the Soviet Football Federation at that time was also part of the highest ranks in the FIFA department. So it's also about connections, it's about structures, and it all happened directly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So for Ukraine and for Ukrainian football players, if we're talking about them, it was not easy. Definitely say that they will play for Ukrainian national team, because as a professional sportsman, you would like to have and continue a professional football career. But if your national football team is not allowed to take part even in the qualification, because Ukraine got a right to take part in official football events only starting from 1994, it means that Russia got the chance to get some of the few most promising young Ukrainian football players for their team, which explains their choice in a way that they wanted to have their football career. So in the end, of course, not everyone agreed to that, but it also shows that yes, sport, it is sport, but it is part of these bigger political and economic changes. It's bigger political and economic disturbances, which of course influence the career of the regular sportsmen, regular football players, an example of Ukrainian one. And important word also that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet football players got a chance, and actually they were the only one who would decide whom they will represent on the international level. So that's why, of course, it influenced their decision. So which football teams they will represent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So on this photo, we see the first, so to say, friendly match of the Ukrainian national team, because until 1994, Ukraine did not play official matches. There were only friendly matches, and this is absolutely the first one against Hungary, where Ukraine actually lost. And if we see the football players who are on these photos, these are not the best Ukrainian football players. These are rather those who were left to play for this friendly match, because the best one definitely were either abroad playing for foreign clubs at that time, because starting from the end of the 80s, Ukrainian and Soviet football players got a chance to play for football clubs abroad. So these one were rather those who left at that time in Ukraine and were invited to participate in this kind of friendly matches. Coming back a bit to Olympic story, it's a photo with Oksana Bayul. It's in 1994. It's the first Olympic Games where Ukraine was officially participating as independent state. It's in Lillehammer. And Oksana Bayul, at that time, 16 years old, figure skating from Dnipro. She was one of the favorites of that events in ladies singles and figure skating, but no one actually expected that she will win that events against American figure skaters. So it was a very, very stunning victory for her. And it's actually the first Ukrainian ever gold medal as independent state in any kind of Olympic Games. And what is interesting in terms of identity and in terms of national representation, that they could not actually, they had to wait more, I think 45 minutes to organize the medal ceremony, because the organizers did not have Ukrainian anthems, they did not have Ukrainian flag. So it was something, because no one expected it to be such a success. So organizers proposed to Oksana Bayul and her trainer, so they're gonna raise either Soviet flag or Russian flag or the national Olympic flag, but the Ukrainian team at that time refused, so they had to go back to the hotel to bring with them Ukrainian anthem, so to put it, because it was an important event for the newly created state, for something that to cheer up also people in Ukraine, because at the beginning of 90s, the situation in Ukraine was very hard economically, politically. So this kind of small victories were very important. And also it feels like talking about it now, it's yeah, who cares if she won the gold medal, who cares which flag is raised in there, but especially for this kind of periods, for these newly created states, but also for people who were actually fighting a lot to get their own state, it is important. And in sport, it's something that it is the most yeah, the most recognizably in symbolic way event that can be achieved. Yeah, and talking about sport for independent Ukraine and its meaning, it has to be said that it's inherited a lot from the Soviet sport. So primarily, it's a technical base and equipment. Secondly, of course, the personal trainers, so those people who are dealing with sport generally. But thirdly, and I think it's important in this context, the idea of sport as an important political instrument for the political self-representation. So in Ukraine, sport was and is an important mechanism where state tries to support sport, where state tries to, even in the hard periods, to finance it, because it is a mirror, it is the representation of Ukraine, it is something that Ukraine might be more or less famous abroad. At the same time, we also experience, especially during the 90s, a big issue of immigration of sportsmen because of the hard economical situation. So we see that also like former Soviet Ukrainian sportsmen, but also the young Ukrainian sportsmen start to represent other countries. At the same time, many trainers and specialists leave the country. So Ukraine loses trainer bases for development. And we also experience the decline of some, I would say, able to call them expensive sports like figure skating or ice hockey. So of course, there is example of Oksana Bayul and also Viktor Petrenko, who also won the gold medal in men's singles and figure skating in 1992, yes. So, but afterwards we experience this in these particular expensive sports, Ukraine do not show good results because of the lack of the people, trainers, and also because of the lack of infrastructure, which is expensive. I took one, I think, very enlightening example to show why sport is important as a political instrument is Summer Olympic Games 1996 in Atlanta, where it was a very visible manifestation of for Ukraine and its people when, in the time of big economic decline, in a time of a big political uncertainties, Ukraine got the 9th place among the all nations on Olympic Games in Atlanta, which was, however, based on, of course, on the former Soviet base, like infrastructure, trainers. At the same time, it was a massive support of Ukrainian diaspora in US who wanted to Ukraine be represented good. They wanted to be Ukraine represented successfully. So it shows, like, at the same time, being at that time the poorest country in Europe, Ukraine landed among the 10 most successfully in a sportsway countries in the whole world. So it shows a bit this discrepancies, but it also shows the meaning of sport generally for the political agenda of the newly created Ukraine, but also, yeah, for people in general. So it's something that was a good news for Ukrainians to read and to follow. And among the like newly happened symbolic victories for Ukraine, I would also like mention the Winter Olympic 2014 in Sochi, when the Ukrainian biathlon team won the golden medal. It was during the Maidan protest. It was shortly before the annexation of Crimea, shortly before the start of the war, when Ukrainian team won the medal in Russia, and I was there, to follow it. And I would say it's something that you cannot deny it. So it's not something that we will call it. It's an important sport victory, but it was also important political victory back then, if we're thinking about that events from now, but also from that perspective of that time. And you see, it's like actually the postage stamp. So it's a very, it became a very historic moment also for the general history of the last 10 years in Ukraine. And it was actually, sport victory. Coming back also to Ukraine and its sport, I think, and I hear it a lot, that if foreigners hear something about Ukrainians or Ukraine, they are primarily the famous sportsmen. So it's not musicians, it's not something that would be from other fields, or I would say like primarily these people are sportsmen. And despite the economic difficulties, despite the fact that competitive sport in general needs stable financial support, sustainable development, Ukraine could, so to say, raise some famous sportsmen, which still, I would say, plays an important role as an instrument for national unity, but also as an instrument, as a united force for the whole Ukraine. And you might see these faces: Andriy Shevchenko, Alina Svitolina, Klitschko brothers, Yana Klitschkova, Yaroslava Moguчих. So these are, I think, one of the, not everyone, but one of the few most famous Ukrainian sportsmen. And of course, if we're talking about sport in the personal dimension, these are these people which can represent it. But we can also talk about the sport in the dimension of bigger events. And of course, in this case, the Euro 2012 played, very important political role for the Ukrainian state, but also for the Ukrainian elites at the time, to get this big sport event, to show that Ukraine, was ready enough to hold this big event, to invite people from the whole Europe to Ukraine, to show Ukraine to the world. So in that case, this event play a very important, a very pushing role for developing infrastructure, but also for Ukrainians itself, to show that they're managed and that capable and ready to hold these events, to be part of the bigger Europe. And it took place only 10 years ago, so it's a very, very recent event. And another thing, which is actually, I don't think it's very known, it's the phenomenon of Ukrainian success at Paralympic Games. So during the last Paralympics, last summer Paralympics, Ukraine took 6th general place among the all countries. And during the last Winter Paralympic Games 2022, Ukraine took even the 2nd place after their Olympic Games host China. So Ukraine was the 2nd best country in Winter Paralympics. And that's a question why it is so. So what is the idea of the success? And I would say there are 2 important components of this Paralympic success of Ukrainian sport. The first one is actually a good developed system of Paralympic sport in Ukraine, which actually based a lot on the particular role of enthusiast. So it's a system of InvaSport, which actually situated in every region of Ukraine. So it gives a chance for people with disabilities to do sports, but also to do sports on a competitive and a professional level. And it's actually the idea of this system serves back to the idea of one person. It's Valeris Shushkevich, so the guy who had this idea to foster the Paralympic sports movement in Ukraine, and it became really successful. But the second point why it is so successful is that sport and representation of Ukraine is actually one of the few ways for fulfillment in Ukraine for the people with disabilities in Ukrainian society. So it also shows that it's something that some people would do not because they want it, but because there is the only chance to be successful and get somehow success in the society. So the question of integration of the heavily injured people will be also a very important question after the end of the war for Ukraine, where so many people got many kind of very heavy injuries. So also we have to rethink this conception, how we integrate people with disabilities into the Ukrainian society, so they not only stay visible when they are successful on sport arenas or only when they represent Ukraine on international level. Coming back to the events that are happening now, so as I've already mentioned, the war against Ukraine has been going during the last 8 years, unfortunately, and it started from gradually destroying Ukrainian sport, and now it is destroying and weakening Ukrainian sport in a massive way. So, of course, it's both in terms of facilities, but also in terms of people's destinies, because it's not only destroying the facilities, it's also about destroying the life of current athletes, but it's also about the raising of the new sportsmen in Ukraine, the new generations of athletes. And in my talk, I was focusing, and I am focusing on the professional sport, but of course, professional sport is part of the general sport development, it's part of the general developments in Ukraine in times of war. So it's only one of the glimpses what we can see what heavy losses and heavy causes has war, the Russian war against Ukraine for Ukrainian sport. I mean, if we're talking a bit about what happened with Ukrainian football, so I will talk very shortly, but from 2014, we experienced that many Ukrainian football clubs, former very successful football clubs, they actually, they disappeared because of the lack of financial support, but because of their general organization of Ukrainian football, which is, actually based on this oligarchic model, but the former oligarchs or the oligarchs who used to be powerful back then, they lost so much money, so much possibilities, so they did not have a chance to, due to the causes of war, due to the economic situation, to finance these clubs. And it actually shows how inefficient actually was the model of, if we're talking about football, of the football development in Ukraine during the last 30 years, which was actually based on this oligarchic model, who would finance this club, who would push the club, and who will try to somehow manage these clubs to be on the same level with the Western professional clubs in Western Europe, if we're talking about football now. But it's not only about football, and of course, I think the most prominent example is Shakhtar Donetsk, who lost his home city already in 2014, who lost their arena, who lost all the infrastructure, and it's only one of the prominent examples. But we can also think about other Olympic sports, other Olympians, and many actually famous Ukrainian sportsmen are from Eastern Ukraine, are from Donbass. So we had to move already to 2014 to other regions of Ukraine. They had to leave their home places, and it's something that, Ukraine experienced already from 2014. But now, of course, it's got even harder, and it got even heavier. So the central if we can define the central consequences of the war, it's primarily, of course, the rethinking of financial and prioritization of how we're gonna finance sport if we have the war, if we have many other important issues to solve. So we can say that Ukrainian sport started to be less financed from the state from 2014, but at the same time they tried to find resources on the local level. So due to the reform of decentralization in Europe, they decided that local communities will try to support the local sportsmen, the local teams. So it's something that happened from 2014. Also, the second one is a crucial one, is the loss of the sport basis facilities, already started from 2014, but is extremely high, started from 2024. And as of September the 1st, 2024, the Minister of Sports of Ukraine reported that 116 sports facilities in Ukraine were partially or completely destroyed after February 24th. It includes, for example, like a big, massive sport complex like the Olympic base in Kharkiv, the ice arena in Serodonetsk, the biathlon base in Chernii region, and many, many different football stadiums, bigger or smaller. So you can also see on these photos, like one of the examples, like up, it's this Olympic base in Kharkiv where the fencers used to do their training. So now you see what kind of conditions they have. And the idea of, and I think it's the right idea of Ukrainian, so to say, politicians that way, that they're not gonna restore all of these objects until the war has ended. So because you never know when the next hit will fall, because today we experienced the whole morning the heatings throughout Ukraine, yesterday. So it's impossible to start any kind of restoration now when the war is in this active phase, which is, yeah, when the war is still on. And the third one, of course, it's impossibility of training, preparation of both professional athletes and juniors, future Ukrainian athletes. So they are forced to go abroad, or they're forced to change their way of living, of trainings. And the fourth thing is also it's involvement of Ukrainian athletes in the armed forces of Ukraine, volunteer, because athletes are, like other citizens of Ukraine, stood up to defend Ukraine. So it's, you cannot say that, so you cannot treat them separately from the general population of Ukraine. So of course, they also, some of them went to the army, or some of them were forced to stop their training, some of them were forced to stop their career. And coming back to this issue of national identity and self-representation, we also can hear a lot from Ukrainian sportsmen in the last month that they are on their own front. So for them, do sport, it's their own like front line, how they call it. And I just took some like recent photos from some like sport successes of Ukraine in the last months, like Usyk, the boxer winning, their synchron swimmers girls, the high jump girls, and the football team. So to show a bit like how they treat themselves in a situation. And what Yaroslava Moguchik said, this is a Ukrainian recordsman in the high jump. So we must focus for our country, she said. We protect our country on a track. So it's something, and she said it during the World Championship in Los Angeles this year. So it's something that you cannot really strictly, write the line between I do my sport or I try to help my country in a way that I can do. And the best way what they can do is they do successfully sport. And yes, what another issue we can now maybe discuss with you is, of course, after I've been talking about the causes of war for Ukraine as sportsmen, facilities, the country, people. So we also get the reaction against Russian sportsmen, and it's an issue of boycott. The war generated the boycott of Russian and Belarusian athletes, and we can also hear from some of the critics of boycott, they like to spread the idea that sport is outside of politics and that their sportsmen are not guilty, and all these things we actually hear from those who say, no, sport is apolitical. But what you've seen before, unfortunately, it is not. And we also see that actually the consequences of war for Ukrainian sportsmen, you cannot just, you cannot just deny them. You see in all the scale. So basically, Russian sportsmen for now are just banned from competitions. Ukrainian athletes are risking their lives. They actually don't have chance also to continue their career in many different cases, etc., etc. And what is actually very, very central issue is that unfortunately sport is part of this new propaganda machine in Russia, and it was, and it continued to be. And I think it's one of the most prominent example in this pro-war rally in Moscow on the 18th of March, when like very, very famous Russian sportsmen, Olympian champions, etc., took place in this event. So they were saying they support their motherland, they support the politics of Vladimir Putin, and all of that. And we might ask, what were the reasons why did they took part in this event? But I would consider like the most successful Russian sportsmen would find a way to get out of this situation, I think. So those who really, like Alexander Bolshinov, who is the biggest star of skiing and Winter Olympics, on the last Winter Olympics, actually. So it's also part of this, actually what surrounds sport in general. And interestingly that, so to say, that like the whole concert was hosted by one of the most famous Russian sport commentators, Dmitry Guberniev. So it also shows how it is actually so sort of connected in this kind of political reality where sport, it is part of it. So what we see that the question of neutrality and if sport is apolitical, it's very, very questionable, like at least to say. And like I think like once is so to say like this difference to see is, on one hand we see that the leader of Ukrainian biathlete team had to be part of the territorial defense force of Ukraine at the beginning of the invasion, full-scale invasion. At the same time, Yelena Isinbayeva, it's a bit old photo, but she was actually one of the Russian few International Olympic Committee members who were still allowed to be presented on the biggest gatherings in the last months. But she, but she never said nothing against the war. She actually supports the war. At the same time, she still try to push the Russian agenda into this big international Olympic gatherings. So, and it's something that we have to face, and something that we have to recognize, and it's something we have definitely rethink, because what Thomas Bach, the president of the Olympic Committee, said in May's speech, he said that Russian people, Russian athletes, and Russian Olympic Committee and the EOAC members in Russia did not start the war, but they did not start the war, but those who do not deny it and those who really in many ways support the war, they have to take consequences, and it has to be visible, and it has to be, and it has to be taken into account, definitely. So ending my my presentation, we can discuss it further. I think it's why actually I decided to take some time to talk about this topic with you, that of course sport is something that unites, it's something that has to be to bring happiness and to come people together, but in these difficult times sport is also something that can help us to influence the bigger political events and bigger political issues, because the pressure on Russian state to stop the war, the pressure on Russian state to stop the war, to so it has to go in a general level, also including the sport. So if we are telling, okay, we allow Russian sportsmen to participate in the events, but at the same time we see the damages of the war. So no, we have to do all possible methods to stop the war, and afterwards, if the situation will change, and if the situation will change, we can talk about the sport and international events and all together gatherings. But for now, unfortunately, sport is part of something that can help us, also to bring some changes on the table, and not only and which is more than just sport, and more than just sport results, because there is no peace without justice. And I think in sport we also have to try to follow this way, to go direction justice and peace. And Stand with Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the presentation for
Wait, let's see if I do like this. Probably because I'm near the. Okay, because I was near the. Anyway, thank you for this presentation, and also thank you in particular for having maintained such a rigorous and academic approach for a topic that touch you also like daily, because we know how we can only imagine how hard it is thinking about work, academic research while a country, while your country, your home is under attack. And so, yeah, thank you. I think thank you also because you introduce several elements that the students in somehow have already started to discuss with this element of the political use of sport neutrality is something that we are discussing quite a lot. So I immediately open the floor to the question. Then I have a couple of questions as well that I want to ask. But first, let's listen from the students that I'm sure they have a lot of questions to ask. So who want to start? Again, feel free to ask whatever type of question you want, more historical, more linked to the present, or link even to the personal experience that Kateryna has described at the beginning of the presentation for introducing herself. Yeah, thank you.
So first of all, thank you for your presentation, and I actually have two questions. The first one is from your point of view, which was the impact of the co-organization of the Euro 2012 between Ukraine and Poland in reshaping the bilateral ties between these two countries after the turbulent times after the Second World War. While the second one is based on what you said about the oligarchic model of the Ukrainian sport. And if we can say that today in forging Ukrainian national identity, a role is played not also by sport football, but also by owners of football clubs. And like such as the figure of Akhmetov, the owner of Shakhtar Donetsk, which is a controversial figure, but today he taken a firm stance in supporting also with some fund the resistance of Ukrainian of the Ukrainian nation against the Russian aggression. So if we can say that today our role is also played by the owner of some clubs in forging and defending the Ukrainian national identity. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I hope I understood all the questions correctly. So coming back to the issue between Poland and Ukraine, yeah, it's a very complex, and Ukrainian and Poland history of its relation is not easy, definitely not easy, but I think not only Euro 2012, but generally the developments and the connections between Ukraine and Poland, where both countries were working on them from there during the last 30 years. So in the end, it also kind of ended also in this manifestation of a friendship during the Euro 2012. So yes, I think it kind of shows this way from the very difficult relationships to the possibility to be one part, to do something together. And we also see it now with starting from 24th of February that Poland helped a lot Ukraine, so also Ukrainian people. There are more than 3 million of Ukrainian refugees now in Poland. And I think in this case, it's somehow these relationships are going to the way to be better, but we cannot deny there are still historical issues, moments which are very difficult between two countries, between people of these two countries. So it's also not ideal, and it cannot be unfortunately ideal. So if I manage to answer like the question. And with oligarchic model, it's a very complex question, because the way how Ukrainian football is organized, it has its legacy from the Soviet past with the idea of patronage, because in the Soviet Union, there was no professional football clubs in the Soviet Union. So basically the football clubs in the Soviet Union were under the patronage of the powerful people, so to say. At that time, they were representatives of the communist elites. What happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the state has collapsed, but the system reshaped itself. So there were founded new people who became the new patrons for the football clubs, and these patrons became oligarchs. And why oligarchs? Because in Ukrainian reality, this idea of diverse financial finance of football clubs is basically impossible because of the poorness of the society. So it is hard to get money from broadcasting, from merchandising. It is hard to get money from these sources, which is normal and gives money for the Western European football clubs. And that's why I think we can assume that the only transfers money bring like considerable amount of money for Ukrainian football clubs, or used to bring money to Ukrainian football clubs. That's why they were actually reliant on this help from oligarchs. If we're talking about the identity issues, Shakhtar is a very interesting example, because it is a football club of Donbas region, and it was, and now it has changed a bit with the war, because they left their home cities, they left their region where they used to build up their identity, and the political elites of Donbas in the 90s actually primarily financed this football club as one of the tools for their political legitimization, as a tool of giving people something back. So football club and football successes were something that local people in Donbas region can say, this is our successes, this is our football team, this is our players, and etc. And now what we're seeing with Akhmetov, he definitely, on the Ukrainian side, he chose this in 2014 already. So but at the same time, he lost a huge amount of influence, of money. So for him, he's not as powerful as he used to be. If we're talking about him in the, like 2008, 9, 10. So when Shakhtar had these amazing successes. And yes, but to be honest, I would say he does not have any other choice. So if he will support separatists in Russia, he will lose in a way. So for him, there is no other choice for now.
Thank you.
Okay, I've just uploaded on Virtuale an article that can be interesting from this point of view. That maybe Kateryna, you know it, by Veth on the Berlusconization of Ukrainian football. That for those who want to have one more reading, of course, it's not compulsory, but you can find it on Virtuale. Other questions? Yeah.
Okay, hello. My name is John, and I'm an Erasmus student from Poland. You were talking about the success of Ukrainian sport and its like kind of assets, and you gave some reasons behind of that. So as far as I remember, the post-Soviet Union countries, like kind of athletes used to underline the like kind of reason of their success as a old school system method when it was like kind of in Soviet Union time. So do you also like consider that one of the elements of success Ukrainian athletes of this element?
So if I understood correctly, that this Soviet system helped a lot to get the sports successes for Ukraine after 1991, right?
Yeah, because I mean, there's some let's say post-Soviet countries like kind of athletes, they were like kind of used to say about this a lot. So that's why I was like kind of curious if also like kind of in Ukraine,
Yeah.
let's say.
Yeah, definitely. This Soviet system, which was actually like what is interesting with this Soviet sport developments in comparison to the sport in Western Europe, then actually, if it was told in the Soviet Union that they developed the sport, but they were not developing the sport, they were developing the competitive sport. So the Soviet system was actually focused on developing competitive good sportsmen. And it was actually Ukraine inherited also started from 1991, this idea that we do not really develop sport in general, that people are healthy, people do sports. We focus on competitive sport. We focus on this big successes which might be achieved by Ukrainian sportsmen to show Ukraine abroad, to be Ukraine known and famous and etc. But the legacy of Soviets is also not only on this level of how it is organized, but also definitely all these now old-fashioned arenas which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet past played especially important role in the 90s, but also I would say the trainers, so those people who were managed to train these people, we can question in which ways they were training the people, because many of them were really, really brutal methods of how to say, like of training sportsmen, of yeah, actually creating this whole idea that we are raising a new sports star. And it's actually what Ukraine inherited from the Soviet time. And I did sport when I was a child, and I was trained by the world champion in acrobatics. And so you rather do sport to become a champion, or you don't do sport at all. So it's not like you just do sport for fun. You just do sport to one day become a champion. So there is no other idea of how it can be in a different way. But what we see now, like 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, many of these Soviet arenas, objects partially got either into the private hands, so they were, so to say, reorganized, so that like there were no that many, for example, ice hockey arenas in Ukraine anymore, or not so many swimming pools anymore, and everything, which actually led until now that Ukraine now has rather modest results than it used to have even in the 90s, even though in the 90s Ukraine was much poorer economic shape than it was in the last decades of Ukraine, because of this Soviet legacy, infrastructural and personal. And also what Ukraine lack now, and it actually was important Soviet legacy, that many Ukrainian trainers, experts switched to other countries where you could earn better money, where they would have better conditions to train the sportsmen, and it is an important issue for Ukraine.
Thank you.
Before you mentioned 1992 as a key date, transition, and then 1994 with the first Olympic medal. But what about 2014? Now, when you mentioned in your presentation the impact that the biathlon women relay had in the days of the Maidan revolution, probably with Italo-centric or say even Eurocentric, if we consider European Union and not a geographical Europe perspective. at that time there was a little bit the relation between sport and politics for those who didn't speak Ukrainian or Russian was very difficult to perceive from abroad, you know. But you mentioned that also by living these days, there were some connection. Can you tell us a little bit more about 2014 and the impact in sport? For example, I recently read in this French review. This French journal, which is named Footballs, it's a new academic journal on football, an article on the destiny, you know, of the football team that were in Crimea, that then some move to Russia, some other were relocated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a really big thing to talk, but I would try to be short. So during the Maidan revolution, so at the end of this 2013, beginning 2014, at the same time, there was this big and important event for Russia, Olympic Games in Sochi, which was a very big instrument of their regime back then. So the way how they tried to organize the best and amazing Olympic Games, where they invested lots of money, and some people say that they used to be one of the most expensive Olympic Games, so there was lots of money was stolen and all the things going around, doping scandals and everything. So it was, apart from Ukraine, there were many things which can be seen how this Olympic Games 2014 were directly connected to bigger political developments at that time. But for Ukraine, in Winter Olympics, Ukraine is not that successful because of the reasons I explained before. Winter sports are expensive, so Ukraine does not have finance to support all kind of winter sports now. So they try to promote like particular sports, and biathlon is one of the sports which Ukrainian state try to promote. So at that time, Ukrainian biathlete team won one of the favorites to win the medals, but was not exactly if they're gonna win the gold medal or not. And it was on the 21st of February 2014, the race took place. And the same time, it was the most damaging days on Maidan, where generally more than 100 people were killed. So you can imagine situations that no one was really taking like care of what's going on in sport fields. So everyone was focused on what's going on in Maidan, the revolution, and it was like the peak of the events when I was back then in Sochi. So I could read it only from the news, and you can feel the like this kind of pressure on yourself, be surrounded. Back then there was not a war yet, but it was understandable that this Russian regime is against the Maidan revolution. So it's against reforms in Ukraine. It's against Ukrainian changes at that time. So it was really hard, because for me, I think it's also interesting point about sport and politics. So I went to Sochi because of sports. So because I wanted to be part of the Olympic Games, like doesn't matter who is a country of like who is a host country. But then when you are there, you remember, you see and you feel it, that it's not only about the sport. It's definitely not only about the sport. So it is something that that connects all different kinds of political, economical, social things all together. And with it rally on the day, I definitely remember the day, and because I was working on the department of medal ceremony. So I met them in person, the Ukrainian girls who won the gold medals, and they were just definitely crying. And all Ukrainians who've been at the time in this Sochi object, or how it's called, like this Olympic stadium, like this Olympic park, they just came to them, and where everyone was crying, everyone was making photos, because everyone also knew the news from Ukraine. And at that time, there were bad news. But what I personally think at that moment, it was a big feeling of hope. So now we got something good. So despite all these bad things that happened, there is one good thing, and now we have the small gold medal, and now we have girls together, and that's why I put this post-stem, because it became one of these really important victories also for those people who don't know what biathlon is and who really don't know what actually happened there. Because biathlon is not football. It's not like everyone follow biathlon or everyone is not really know who they are. But in the end, this kind of small things, when they are connected to these bigger developments, they start to go beyond just sport result, but reconnect, with the historical events as itself.
Other question? Come on, don't be shy. Yeah.
So I want to ask you, in your opinion, whether you would support a non-discriminatory exclusion of Russian athletes from international sport events, or if you will allow for some exception to take place, for example, Russian athletes who do not take stance in favor of the war or who take stance against the war, or there is some room for exceptions, or if the logic of sanctioning Russia takes the priority over all other logic.
I hope I could hear everything what you asked, but the thing is, like, when I'm thinking about this question, I think that the ban of Russian sportsmen and the Belarusian sportsmen, in my eyes, has to be primarily not that we just ban them because they're Russian sportsmen, but because we ban the regime, and it is one of the mechanisms to force the regime to negotiate to stop the war. So it's actually one of the instruments, not to ban sportsmen as itself, but it is, and it has to be one of the many mechanisms. So sport is one of the things. So it has to be sport, like culture, other things. So everything that in the end has to push Russian society and its elites to stop. And if we're talking about if Russian sportsman has to say I'm pro or against war, yes, they may do it, but in the end they will be just banned from their own country. But I'm not sure if it will have influence on the whole system as it is. So, but what I find actually inappropriate, that this neutral status in this way. So if we're talking about doping, okay, there we can go this way when we say we have particular sportsmen whom we check and they are clean and we allow them to participate as neutral sportsmen. And in this case, in the case of war, it's not a bit, but it's a huge difference in a way how the war influence, and not only so to say the destiny of Russian sportsmen, but also primarily the destiny of Ukrainian sportsmen, of Ukrainian state, and of Ukrainian people. And in this case, I'm for ban of Russian and Belarusian sportsmen, and also not only sportsmen, but also what is important of Russian officials, which are still not banned. There are still some Russians who are leading the International Federation of some sports, like I think Czech, like how to say it, Schach and other things. So they are still taking decisions. They are still in a higher positions. And it's something that for now, I mean, I'm not talking that we'll ban them forever. No, we have banned them for now as a reason and as an instrument to take all possible measures to stop the war, to put the pressure. And this pressure is hard, but it's, in my opinion, this pressure is, there is no other way, unfortunately.
And also speaking about this aspect of the athletes, we are going to discuss again when we are speaking about athletes activism, but we have not to forget that for our international federation could be dangerous to exclude or not to exclude an athlete asking to take a stance if he or she lives in an authoritarian country, because there will be personal problems if they took a public political position. We are seeing it speaking about Iranian athletes, for example. Anyway, other question? Yes.
It's not forever, not ban them forever, but ban them for now can destroy their career, also for the Russian athletes, as well as the Ukrainian athletes who are now in war. So what about them?
Yeah, I understand this argument, but the thing is that the career of particular sportsmen in the eyes of the totally destructive war, unfortunately, it's just a sports career, but it's not the life, because comparison to Ukrainian sportsmen, they are really under the risk to lose their life, not only to lose their career. And I think it's something that has to be taken into account when we're comparing Ukrainian sportsmen and Russian sportsmen in this situation. It's about life or it's only about the career. So.
And also now we are speaking about sport, but often when they ask, when we analyze this aspect, I try to stay out of ethical consideration. But when the question, and it's a fair question that you ask, it's on ethical consideration, I always suggest to think about also not only about sportsmen, but sanction against a country have an impact not only to athletes, but also to everyday men. And no one said, oh, but the poor men who work at McDonald's now lost his job because McDonald's has left the country. So we always have to think in the bigger picture. Other questions?
I would like to ask, based on what you said, I would like to ask why Russia was not excluded for sports even before the invasion of Ukraine, because we have to consider their events such as the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, or Russia invaded, Georgia in 2008 in order to stop the regime. So why?
And in both occasions, I added they violated the Olympic truce. That was the formal decision to exclude them. Yeah, Kateryna.
Yeah, I think it's a very on-time question, because it shows what actually feels to be so radical now. So, oh, we ban all the Russian sportsmen. Actually, so many things had to be started already 2008, 2014. So it's something that we are all the time postponing, hoping for the better, hoping that we can somehow in a more mild way change the situation. But we see that the consequences, and it's not only if we're talking about sport, it's general sanctions against Russia after the illegal annexation of Crimea and Donbas war, which were like just inappropriate. So the sanctions were actually just very formal. So they did not change nothing. So we see that they did not change the behavior of the regimes. They did not change the situation. And it actually something that I think Ukrainians understood it before. So they understood and they felt it before. But for many people who are like on a side of the conflict, so they're just observing the war on a side, for them, it's still sometimes unclear why do we have to do in such a harsh way? Why do we have to act in such a harsh way? Because unfortunately, the mild way do not work anymore, and they did not work also before. But it was only tried to cover these big problems with these mild decisions, with these half steps, but it does not work, and it does not stop this war, stop this regime. Also, it's not that what I feel sometimes that Ukrainian position now, it feels so aggressive because Ukrainians do not want to negotiate. They would like to liberate their country, but the thing is like, unfortunately, if we stop now, the war will come the next year. If we do not do like all what we can do now, it will not end, and that's what we don't want to experience second time. And yeah, and it's hard, and it's something like yeah, and the sport is only one of the aspects of it, and it's only one of these hard decisions that has to be taken about participation, not participation. But in the end, I think what our aim is that in the end, there is peace and there is justice in Europe, also for Russia one day, and also for people who live in that country. But before that, we cannot act in another way. So yeah.
Thank you. And if there are not any other question, I have one last. And I don't know if it's that easy to answer, but I hope just to have a feedback, because I've read at the eve of Euro 2021, the male football European Championship. There, in the English, Italian, French press arrive a little bit a debate that was probably more developed inside Ukraine, on the fact that Shevchenko, who now is a Ukrainian symbol, is fully engaged on Ukrainian defense against the Russian invasion, but his mother language was Russian, is or was Russian, no? And so there was a debate that from some more nationalist and far right parts of parties of Ukraine, there were some critics for those let's say Ukrainian athletes which were who were more like culturally Russian, despite being Ukrainian. So can you very quickly describe to us that we are not a Ukrainian speaker or Russian speaker, this type of tension which were existing before the war, that now we are seeing that they are not anymore a kind of division inside Ukraine, and somehow now the war has reinforced Ukrainian identity despite language divisions?
Yes, in Ukraine there are, like, to understand the situation between languages in Ukraine, it's hard to go short, but I will try to do it short. So first question which we have to ask, why many Ukrainians in Ukraine used to speak Russian as a mother language? So, and this question goes back to the historical consequences of the history of Russian-Ukrainian relationship, of the politic of Russification, of the politic of ban of Ukrainian language. So basically, the legacy of Russian-speaking Ukrainian goes back to the forbiddenness of Ukrainian language, of the forced Russification of Ukrainian population, and it only the, so to say, the consequences of this politics. In the last 30 years of Ukraine, we see that the amount of people who speak Ukrainian is increasing. And I'm from Russian-speaking family, but the way I'm from Russian-speaking family does not make you less Ukrainian in Ukrainian context, because it's not about, so you do not choose which language you speak when you when you are born, but you see, if you're coming back, why your mother speak particular language, so you know the, so you know the political reasons and historical things which led to this thing. And now we see that even those who were raised in Russian-speaking families, they switched to Ukrainian. But it is important to understand that in Ukraine, the majority of people are bilingual. So it's not that if you speak Russian, don't speak Ukrainian. If you speak Ukrainian, don't speak Russian. It's rather the way which language you prioritize in your communication. It's not the ways that you speak only one of these languages. And now people prioritize Ukrainian as a way also, for me personally, it's just painful to hear Russian. It is just hard, like, even though it is my mother language, but you really mentally connected to the situation, what you experience, what your family experience, what your country experience. And that's why now we see that people start to speak more and more Ukrainian, even those who used to speak Russian. But of course, we cannot force people to change the language. I mean, it's hard. It's also kind of, you have to put an effort. That's why there are still people who still speak Russian, even though they are not less Ukrainian in a way. But I think when we are asking these questions, we really primarily have to go back to the consequences, why it is so, and yeah, and then we will see. And because it also gives us an idea of this initial ideological background of the war which Russia runs against Ukraine, because it is based on the idea there is no Ukrainians, there is only one state, there is only one Holy Russia, and Ukrainians are just part of this big imperial concept, which is also based on this language issue. So yeah, I hope I try to give some ideas to understand why it is so. But what's important is to speak Russian does not mean that you're Russian. So at the same time, it's this concept does not goes like nationality and language are not the same in Ukrainian case.
Okay, thank you very much, Kateryna. I think you really help us to have a better understanding of what is happening now in general, not only sport, and also before to have a very clear focus on the political history of Ukrainian sport. So thank you very much. One last question for you, which I just ask if you can send to me the slide so I can share with the students also later on. There's no hurry. And also, if you want to suggest some readings, I will put on the among the material they can decide to read if they want. So again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. I disconnect. Bye.